So welcome everybody. The cheerful topic of this discussion is going to be about regeneration and collapse, but I actually am going to use that term regeneration a lot in this presentation. And Stephen gave a beautiful introduction to kind of the critical nature that soil plays, not just for soil health and for our ecology, but for everything. And some of the things that I want to share is that, soil is the key to sequestering excess carbon. And not only that, it's actually the key to preventing conflict and political unrest. And I'm going to explain a little why, how it's not just about what's underneath our feet, but soil is really everything. Like, it is the basis of all life on the planet. And it's something that the hopeful part of it is that soil is incredibly resilient and adaptive. And, it's made up of these mysterious components, but luckily, soil has a lot to teach us about adaptation and resilience, because in the midst of collapse, you can actually build soil health, and in thousands of different ways. And so I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of the lessons I've learned from around the world and then tie it back into the soil principles. Next slide. So, climate change, basically what it means is ecosystems in transition. And, the reality is I don't think there's anybody who will deny that climate change is happening around the world. But what it also means is that there's not always an inherent good or an inherent bad. What happens with climate change is things transition. And in order to be resilient and adaptive, one of the things we need to do is understand that transition actually is an opportunity for regeneration. And that even though our ecological systems are under great stress, there are ways to kind of remediate and mitigate and hold some of that stress. And you can do that through regenerative practices. So the next slide, please. So, some of our biodiversity stresses, I think a lot of us know what they are, but there is just huge amounts of seasonal and yearly variation. I mean, Stephen's seen it on the farm here. There's temperature changes, there's precipitation changes, there's extreme weather phenology that's just happening all over the planet. I think a lot of us have read about the incredible rates of extinction that have happened, not just with plants and animals, but with insects, kind of worldwide. And then in the in the Northeast, we've got cold water fisheries, we've got moose, we've got eastern hemlock, we've got insect taxa, and there's just a lot of like reproductive and like survival stress that we witness within our biodiversity. And that's not just in North America and the Upper Valley, but it's just all over the world. And, we are starting to notice these things with kind of our information sharing and social media and scientific articles and things like that. I think we're a lot more aware of it. But quite frankly, this has been happening for thousands and hundreds of years to just indigenous cultures all over. And so, part of this is really understanding that regeneration and collapse is kind of a global and shared form of suffering. And it's almost like we have a responsibility when we talk about things like just transition to understand that everything we do matters, and that starting with the soil is an incredibly empowering place to be, because it really, everything you do with soil health will help other systems that rely on that soil for survival. Next slide. So these are just pre-COVID, because I think the world has been changing very rapidly, is that, without rapid decarbonization in the next 10 years or 12 years at the most, the projected climate refugees by 2050 is 200 million plus. The price increase for staple crops by that same date, just as a result of climate change, is going to be wheat 67%, rice 80%. This is just a very short list. And just in China, which is a country that has a huge amount of people, water scarcity by 2100 is going to affect over 1 billion people, and that's just in one country. And the global economic effect of that, they say, is going to be about 600 trillion, but quite frankly, it's going to be a lot higher than that. And some of the costs you can't even calculate when you look at what it does to communities or people who are having to move around the world. Next slide. So here's an example. So this is a country where this little girl, I mean, literally her plant, the place where she stands, her local environment is sinking as a result of climate change. And you can see these palm trees in the background. This is a coastal area. And it's just, literally what happens is that sea rise and climate change is literally going to make people move around the world. So it's something where we have to pay attention to the fact that as bad as we think things are, they're always worse for somebody else. And so everything we do matters at a scale that sometimes we can't even comprehend. Next slide. So if we think about COVID-19, there's a lot of parallels and similarities to this virus. They're both public health emergencies because climate collapse and climate change is impacting the mental, social, and physical health of people all over the planet. They're both ecological emergencies. There's a lot of parallels that have shown that the spread of viruses and kind of these superbugs that we're experiencing over time and likely to experience a lot more over time are really caused by systems collapse. They're caused by the lack of wildlife health and the lack of rangeland management for a lot of species of animals that are under stress. And so when they interact with humans, previously they might not have transitioned or transferred disease, but now they do because they themselves are facing disease systems. They're both going to cause a lot of economic collapse around the United States and around the world. And quite frankly, both of them are human-induced. Climate collapse, climate change, COVID, there's human responsibilities that we have for both of these calamities that we face. And they're both products of disease systems. I mean, we've got habitat loss, we've got lack of biodiversity, we've got soil depletion. The list just goes on. And so, I think COVID, in a strange way, it's like viruses aren't inherently bad. I mean, we need viruses to kind of change our ecologies as we go through time, and they're important for our evolutionary systems. But there's also things about them that can teach us things about how we respond to these systems collapses and these stresses that we feel in our environments. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about regenerative ecology. And, Stephen mentioned regenerative ag, which is part of regenerative ecology. And, what this is essentially is it's looking at ecology from a different lens. It's saying that in order to be resilient, we have to acknowledge the fragilities that we are experiencing, and we have to become what is called anti-fragile. And what that really means is not just saying you're becoming resilient, but adapting to changes as they come. And as you adapt, rather than exploiting the environment, what you try to do is you try to regenerate things. And so rather than causing things to deplete, you're really using a completely different framework when you design any intervention. And so overseas, we do it all the time because I work in these countries that are under huge amounts of stress. And so they may have had, lack of access to food for decades because of conflict. And so you're building like a food chain system, or you're looking at lack of access to water for a significant amount of time. And so what it does is it, rather than looking at things as being exploitive, you're always looking at solutions that are regenerating. So they're adding complexity to a system, not trying to simplify it by taking things away. Next slide. So, this is just a kind of an example of what it is. And it's really a state of mind. And I always try to explain it when you're trying to design like anything from a planning system to like a food security system. A good way of thinking about it is that in a regenerating system, you are counterbalancing an exploitive approach. So basically, what you're always trying to do is you're trying to decrease energy use. And a lot of times, the way I work with it is because a lot of times in some of the countries that I work with, they literally can't move things around because they don't have these systems that we have in terms of they don't have a huge amount of oil production sometimes. They also might have limited ability to kind of move things around, and so they need to have systems in place that usually are alternative, that are almost always regenerative, and are looking at ways of counterbalancing things that are very carbon heavy. And so the great thing about regenerative ecology is when you apply it to any system, it has the same exact principles, which is that basically you're looking for participation in the design, because the participation is critical, because you're not working against nature, you're using humans to be integrated into the natural system. And so by trying to improve like soil health, for example, or food security, you're looking at ways that humans become an integral part of that system. And so you're always trying to reconcile things that are preventing humans from working with nature in a way that gives them the food that they need, or the farming or land that they need in a way that's going to be regenerative. And it's restorative. I mean, you're looking at systems where often you're trying to build up farmland that maybe has been in disuse for decades because of war, or here, you know, because farming has changed so much and you've had these big kind of like agro-biz systems. What's happened is that at every scale, you have to look at regeneration, and you have to look at what are you doing to increase or to decrease the energy use, and basically promote a way of doing agriculture that uses less carbon. Next slide. So the principles follow a lot of what people might be familiar with permaculture a little bit, but it's slightly different. It's looking at systems that and principles where you're always trying to be redundant, meaning that, you know, people ask about biodiversity, and what it essentially means is making sure you have redundancies, because if something becomes diseased or if something doesn't work, you always want to have something else that is similar to see whether that might work. And so redundancy is incredibly important in regenerative ag and regenerative practices. And the reason for that is you're always experimenting to see what works best with the integrated systems that you're working with. The other principle that's really important is this idea of multifunctionality. And what that means essentially is that, you know, you want things that serve many functions. If you're doing a water system, you want people to be able to drink it, but you also want to be able to use it for irrigation and crops. If you're doing a road, you might want the road to be built in such a way that it increases movements for goods so that people can get from markets, but you also want the road to provide berm protection if you have floods or extreme weather events. So you're building the road in such a way that you're creating like berms, or you're creating wildlife corridors, or you're creating some type of management system that is using the road as a way of creating health and movement. And so it's a big part of these systems. The other thing is interconnection. A lot of times when you're looking at regenerative ag or regenerative practices such as permaculture, one of the things that you're looking at the fact that human systems interact with natural systems, but it doesn't stop there. There's social systems, there's political systems, and so you're always looking at a design system that tries to react and tries to kind of interact with those connections. And even if those connections seem to be in conflict with one another, you're trying to figure out and keep challenging those systems to integrate with one another. Because the idea behind regeneration is, rather than exploit people or exploit systems, you're trying to learn how these systems can actually be regenerative. And one of the keys to that, and I think especially in the Upper Valley, in the Northeast, and in the North American context, you know, things have to be locally adapted. You know, you can do these at any scale, but every system has to have local knowledge. Like, you have to adapt it to where you are. You know, whether if you've stolen land from somebody, or if you have like a very denuded landscape, or you have a complex like social conflict, you have to work with those local contexts because whatever system you design, it's not going to be regenerative unless it's adapted to those local problems and conditions. But the interesting thing is that a lot of this knowledge is in our bodies. I mean, it's literally in our memories. I mean, there's incredible amounts of wisdom that is actually all around us. Like, most of the systems that we have in the Upper Valley, quite frankly, are global systems that have been adapted for the North American context. I mean, I can drive around Vermont farms and I can look at probably 20 systems and I can tell you where they've come from in different parts of the world, because we actually have adapted a lot of this global knowledge to our local context, especially in Vermont. There's a lot of examples of this, and it's fascinating. So those are just some principles that we can think about. Next slide. So soil is life. Stephen said this beautifully. It is, I couldn't write that font big enough. The soil food web is just, it's critical for the planet. It's critical for our survival. And it's really, really important that we think about soil from all perspectives, and not just under our feet, but we think about where we get our food and how we're treating the systems that we're a part of, and how they literally, every single one of them is dependent on soil. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide. You've probably seen it a million times. What is soil? Essentially, it's air, water, mineral matter, and a very tiny bit of organic matter. Like, actually, soil itself is a very small amount of organic matter, but that organic matter is everything. Without it, you can't have, you really can't have good quality life. And soil that's been bioengineered, there's ways of remediating soil. And it's a very important practice in regenerative ag, is that a lot of what we're doing actually, when we look at soil, Stephen mentioned that in North America, hundreds of years ago, there used to be, feet upon feet of topsoil here. I mean, and not topsoil, really, really good soil. And now it's like you're working with these very denuded landscapes. And so, part of it is understanding that, good soil health and good regenerative practices rest in this idea of always experiment with improving soil health. And we go back to the soil principles, but we can also use different practices from around the world that within, a year, 2 years, 3 years, it's amazing the changes you can make to an incredibly denuded landscape. Next slide. So this is a slide that just shows some of the different types of soil that we have and that we kind of struggle with. But I will challenge to say that honestly, around the world, I've seen things grow in soil that I can't believe things grow in. So the beauty of soil is it is one of the most regenerative structures I've ever witnessed in my life. Is that the way you can build soil is just phenomenal over time. Next slide. So this is probably a slide that may be familiar to some of you, and basically what it shows is it's showing you the idea that the more healthy your soil is, the easier it is to grow different types of vegetation. And so basically it's just saying that, there's certain kind of succession patterns with growth that basically just strengthen the soil. So the more you can put in the soil, the better your soil will be over time. And so the more you can leave in the soil, transitioning to perennials instead of annuals, transitioning to kind of trees over time, or mixing grasses with trees, and doing different types of kind of growing, whether you're market gardening or doing silvopasture, or you're doing agroforestry or forest gardens. There's just a lot of different practices you can do and introductions you can make that actually will build soil health up pretty quickly. Next slide. So, what's great is that, we live on a planet that has a very beautiful topography. And a lot of us live in places where we can work with the landscape. So rather than, making very complex, like irrigation systems or relying on super complex water filtration systems, in soil health, you actually can use some pretty basic things to slow and sink water in a way that allows you to grow lots of things on a landscape that you wouldn't think could actually bear life in that way. Next slide. So this is kind of an aerial view of a part of China. And what's really interesting about this is you can see The areas where water flows, because it always will flow down from ridges into valleys, and so you can see where the valleys are, there's a lot more water retention, and so they've got a lot more green plants. But even on a small landscape, like this is a pretty big area, but even on a small landscape on your own property, you can do this. And some people do it by farming in areas where it's already naturally present, or if they can't, they may actually build systems on their farms or on their food landscapes to actually slow or sink water so that they can use it for natural irrigation. Next slide. This is just another example in Nepal where it's kind of interesting, because what they do there is they'll build these little villages up high, and then they'll use the terrace landscapes for growing rice and things like that. And then they've basically been able to support a pretty big number of people with very concentrated areas of food production, and it just protects the rest of the landscape, which is really great. Next slide. And this just shows you, if you capture water when it runs downhill, this is a natural catchment basin that actually was man-made. But you can do this on a small scale, you can do it on a wide scale, and it's literally been done around the world for all kinds of crop management. Next slide. So I want to honor the fact that these practices are really old, but they're really old practices that actually have been adapted and used over time. So they've been incredible gifts to us down the centuries and down the years. And a good thing to ask ourselves always I like to say, like, one of my favorite questions is, are we being good ancestors? And one way of thinking about that is, are the practices that I'm doing now regenerative for the earth that I now live on? And so chinampas is a good example. They were invented by the Aztec civilization, ancient civilization. And basically what happened is they were experiencing a lot of climate change. And so they were having these huge floods. And so what they did is they would take these flooded landscapes and they would create these floating gardens. And they did it through creating these artificial islands that were basically built by interweaving reeds with stakes beneath the lake surface, and they would create these kind of underwater fences, and then they would build soil content on top of those little islands to grow food on. And it was incredible practice that they developed kind of in response to fluctuating drought and rainy periods, and it was incredibly successful for them. And it's actually practiced in multiple countries around the world. Indonesia does it, Nepal does it. So the practice itself, whether it's from trade or whether it's from the travel of information or whether it's ancestral in our DNA, these practices do survive over time. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide, because if you think about it, there's a continuum that exists between nature and the way we practice agriculture as humans living currently in the 21st century. And the beauty of nature is that there are things within nature that make it adaptive and naturally resilient. And the things that make it adaptive and naturally resilient are the same things that actually put it at risk. And I'm going to explain that a little bit. So in nature, it has really low fragility, meaning that, things just want to grow. Even in soil that is incredibly denuded, things really, really want to grow. Whereas in agriculture, if there's an extreme weather event or people lose their cropland, especially in kind of this monomass agriculture we have in North America, it's really, really vulnerable to fragility, because I was in South Sudan a few years ago when they were having the beginning of those big floods they're having now. And it was fascinating because, what happened is that, people lost just huge amounts of their arable land where they had done heavy ag. But in areas where they had done like other kinds of agriculture, meaning more regenerative practices, the impact of it was very minimal. And those are areas where I would say they were doing like some civil pasture, they were doing like much more biodiverse kind of concentrated gardening practices. And so there's things that we do within the agricultural systems that are very different than what we do in nature. And so the closer you can get to mimicking the way nature provides food and energy and resources, the more likely we are to be regenerative. And so this continuum is kind of interesting because what it does is it allows us to think differently, because what we want to do is we want to be anti-fragile. And what that means is we want to create agricultural systems that regenerate our landscape and that use less energy and actually use a different kind of land and animal management, so that we're looking at more rotational practices and things that carbon sequester and don't actually draw carbon out from the soil. Next slide. So these are just some examples. I mean, there are some amazing examples. This is in China, and this is an area where they had an old road and it had just been, you know, just travel on forever, and they're just areas of heavy drought and just like way overused. And it basically just, what they did is they did concentrated planning to regenerate this old road system that kind of spanned these two villages. And the idea was to create more arable land for people that lived very rurally and no longer use these old road systems, but also turn the old road systems into places where people could grow food. So this is a project in China. Next slide. It can also be personal. This is the Jordan Valley, and this is just, you know, somebody's yard, you know, and I mean, basically, I mean, you can see that soil. I mean, that soil is just incredibly denuded, but over time, what you can do is the more you introduce to the landscape, and you can see like this gentleman, you know, I mean, it's really like the more biodiversity you have, the more experimentation, the more redundancy, the more you're just not afraid of plant failure. Just put things into the ground, the more likely you are to have regeneration and in a short amount of time. Next slide. And then also, I use the term remediation mindfully, is that regeneration and remediation are very close allies. And in India, what they've done is in places where there's been a lot of pollution and a lot of urban stress, they've been starting to turn these like incredibly polluted areas into sinks. And what I mean by that is that they're calling them green sinks, and places basically where people can reclaim those areas and bioremediate by using those areas that have been incredibly polluted to make them healthy again, for things like this is a little aquaculture pond that actually has fish in it. And the fish themselves are providing remediation for a very terrible environment that used to be there. But it's healthy for the fish. It doesn't hurt them. The plants along the side also help with the remediation of the water content. And then the water eventually will act as a filtration system for the water from that urban center. Next slide. And then it just breeds life. This is an area in Indonesia that had Central Sulawesi that had conflict for just decades. And you know, when they didn't have as much conflict, people wanted to go back into these areas and grow food, and they did. And so what you saw over about an 11-year, I guess it was 13-year period, is you saw these areas that were incredibly denuded turning into living landscapes again. And the reason for that is people moved back into these areas and they started experimenting and they started growing things again. And it really provided new life to those areas that had been really denuded over time. Next slide. So it's definitely, regenerative agriculture is a state of mind. You know, in North America especially, you know, and farming, you know, people have a way of farming, and you know, it's often the way that they've learned how to farm from maybe a family member or something they've read, and sometimes maybe they haven't read enough or they haven't experienced different practices. And so, you know, it's really a state of mind to know, when does this practice of agriculture become exploitive? And when is it in balance with the land? And when is it adding things to the living biology that we're so reliant on? Next slide. So the big thing is that agriculture, like Stephen said, it is important. I mean, we can't live without food. And it's an incredibly just integral part of the human experience, is being a part of a living landscape. And there are lots and lots of soil solutions that mitigate human damage. And they can be done at a big scale, they can be done at a small scale, they can be done literally on any scale you can imagine, they can be done. Next slide. And what you want to do is you want to think about it always from this slide a little bit, which is that it's not enough to be resilient. Like that puts you kind of in balance. But what you really want to do is you want to be anti-fragile. And the way to do that is to really keep thinking regeneratively all the time. And whenever you face a challenge and you're looking for a response system or a solution, the thing you want to think about is it promoting fragility or is it promoting anti-fragility? And if you're going towards the anti-fragility framework, my guess is you're going towards regeneration. And if you're worried about something that's going to be really fragile, you're being exploitive. And I can say that about almost any system of planning I've been a part of. Next slide. So, in Vermont and around the world, we've got a lot of heat and drought. And actually, that's going to be a big problem. I mean, ironically, yes, we're going to have increased rain, but that increased rain is actually going to cause increased drought in Vermont as well. Next slide. So these are just some figures to kind of consider is the range and increases of average temperature, and then increases in heat waves. And the problem with this heat and drought, of course, is that it's really hard on human health. It's incredibly hard on soil health because soil suffers when there's huge fluctuations in temperature, and when soils get too hot, they do tend to lose organic matter. It's like you do want to heat your soils, like there's some kind of counteractive thoughts to that, but the reality is very, very high temperatures are incredibly difficult for soil structure. Next slide. So a lot of what we'll do in Vermont, my guess is that over time we'll do a lot more tree-based agriculture. It's really important to experiment with this and show people how incredibly valuable this can be, because just planting 20 or 50 trees can make a huge difference in soils and carbon sequestration, and it's pretty easy to do. There's certain animals that tend to work better with silvopasture, but quite frankly, I've seen it done all over the world with probably every kind of animal imaginable. So my theory is I think it works with almost everything. And you can really do a lot of different types of trees and plantings. And so tree-based agriculture is incredibly important. And so the slide on the left shows you a lot of the principles of regeneration, because you can see there's lots of redundant crops. There's different kinds of crops that are different for different multifunctionalities, and you can see a lot of interconnections of the use of the land. So you can see like a grape arbor, you can see a nuthatch grove, you can see a lot of different crops that are being grown, and so people are thinking differently about their production systems and you won't see any bare soil in that landscape. Next slide. So the big principle with tree-based agriculture is tree cover is good. I mean, it for health outcomes, for mitigating and remediating particulate pollution, fewer premature deaths. I mean, just the more tree cover we can integrate into every kind of landscape, the better. And this is urban and rural. It also is incredibly important for soil temperature and soil health. I mean, things are just naturally cooler in the shade, but it also helps with transpiration. And so that increases really rapidly when soil is above 70 degrees. And so you really want to, discourage that from happening. And then tree cover improves animal health and reproduction. I mean, animals do better in those kinds of climates. Next slide. So this is about landscape water management. Next slide. So, basically this is just about thinking differently about how we manage water, because one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in Vermont and the Upper Valley is this is a lot of water happening in these weather events and kind of just pummeling farms. And so I think that a lot of places over in countries where I've worked, they've done really innovative practices to manage like really heavy rain events. And we're going to have to think about that with everything, with road building, with farms, and there's just a lot of really ancient practices that are incredibly cheap and are not carbon heavy that should be used more, especially in our Upper Valley and kind of Vermont landscapes. There's just a lot of ways of increasing soil organic matter improvements with landscape water management, and some of it is just, you know, using earthworks instead of a lot of carbon heavy systems, and then integrating, you know, integration with grazing and tree crop patterns just basically minimize the amount of water you have to use, and then using different kinds of like earthen dams and infiltration basins that are more organic in nature and rather than big fossil fuel intensive irrigation systems. Next slide. So this shows you Vermont and Irene, and gosh, I mean, just a tremendous amount of damage in a very, very short amount of time. Next slide. So, you know, this is going to be a fact of life in Vermont, is going to be a lot of floods. And, you know, I think, you know, we're just going to have a lot of precipitation. And so to think very clearly about regeneration rather than just mitigation is really helpful when you think about the trends that are likely to happen over time. And so some of it is like, you know, when these major storm events are going to happen, they are going to happen because they've happened with increasing frequency in Vermont, and then just a lot more in the northern Atlantic. Is that, you know, there are ways of thinking about how to deal with floods well in advance, and a lot of it has to do with regenerative practices. Next slide. So in Vermont, a really good solution for some of the anticipated floods and weather events is to think about things that are, once again, regenerative, so multifunctional, you know, and that provide kind of bigger and more services. And a lot of this is like looking at riparian buffers and kind of wetland preserves, like places where you can kind of sink in slow water, and having those, you know, as more and more as practices within the agricultural system in Vermont that are either, I don't want to say they have to be mandatory, but should become kind of common parlay when it comes to land use management and planning. And then the other thing is that agriculture itself can be a productive buffer if you do regenerative ag. And so, you know, you can actually increase land and food production by doing these types of mitigation practices. Next slide. And it kind of falls in, it's interesting, like a lot of this falls into more food, because a lot of the regenerative practices that you do to kind of adapt and remediate, you know, anticipated climate change impacts is by maximizing biodiversity and using different kinds of landrace varieties. What happens is you're actually building soil health, you're creating food security, because you're creating, you know, crops and food plants, pollinator structures, and things that are much more ecologically sound and not as fragile as some of the GMO varieties that we use. And it basically just provides better human health. Next slide. And a big part of this, this is pretty prevalent in permaculture, is forest gardens. And the reason for this is that, you know, forest gardens are, you know, polycultures of multi-purpose plants. And so they produce a huge amount of products in very small spaces. And so they don't leave a lot of bare soil. They use something that's called gilding, which is basically looking for varieties of plants that grow well together. And the reason they grow well together is because their mycology and the way that they interact with fungi and kind of the subterranean of soil is collaborative. And so those guilds of plants that we use in forest gardens have a relationship. They have a symbiotic relationship that is just beautiful, because when they grow well together, they're going to provide a great abundance of food and products for you and your families, but also they're going to build soil health over time. That's going to be like, even if you test a small area that does an edible forest garden over a 3-year period, you're going to see a huge change in soil health, much more so than you'd see with conventional gardening. Next slide. And so, you know, regenerative too, the ecosystem functions are really important. So you're always thinking about this kind of multifunctionality and this interconnection. And so you're looking for things that are nitrogen fixation, things that accumulate a lot of different varieties and purposes. You're looking for plants that provide nectar, and you're looking for things that kind of can be pest confusers as well. So you're looking at, rather than killing insects with like pesticides and things like that, you're just looking at a way of using plant matter and plant relationships to confuse the insects you don't want and to encourage the insects you do. So rather than exploiting nature by trying to kill all of the insects with these pesticides that are just so harmful to so many of the good insects we need, you just confuse the ones that you don't want in your crops. And then you don't have to kill them because they often serve other purposes in other landscapes. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about the wetlands and riparian zones, but a big part of the regenerative land practices is thinking about creating banks so that when you have water, that it's not eroding the soil along those water edges, which is a big problem with farming and agricultural practices. You're providing buffers, and what that means essentially is like pathways that exist between two functions of land or land management that provide a space or an edge that tends to have a lot of biodiversity and encourages insect and plant life that's more natural rather than using pesticides. And then corridors, both for human movement and wildlife movement, but also for insect movement, because you really need corridors of certain colors and types of plants so that insects have like landing, I like to call them landing runways. So you have to think intuitively about what you're planting and what they need, because those things are incredibly important for regeneration. Next slide. So you've got to think about everything when you're thinking about regeneration. You're thinking not just about the soil, but you're thinking about the entire planet. You're thinking about pollinators, and you're thinking about all of the things that they need in terms of color spectra and nectaries and different kinds of plant species, and things that basically encourage habitat features that are critical for pollination, because bees pollinate 2/3 of our fruit and food, and they also are responsible for 85% of pollination. And so without bees and certain pollinators, I mean, human life cannot exist. So these things are not just nice things to do to protect pollinators, they're practices that are incredibly important for all life on the planet. And so, agroforestry, combining agriculture and tree-based management and care, is incredibly important, because what it does is it lets us expand farming into forests without taking those forests and clear cutting them for farming, because the idea is there's an interconnection that exists between food production and trees. And for many, many centuries, and actually in most parts of the world, they don't just clear cut for agriculture. They actually do an connected system between trees and food. And what's hurt us is these big agrobiz systems that have basically took out the forest, but we need to bring that connection back into regenerative land management. And then the riparian buffers and kind of on-farm wetlands, those are important not just for habitat reserves, but they're really important for flood and drought resilience. And so, thinking about how we can help farmers think more about kind of habitat management is really critical. Next slide. And so this is just a picture of what happens when you leave plants in the ground. Like, the more plants, the better the roots. And it's just really important. I just can't say it enough. Like, regeneration is just plant, plant, plant. Like, put as much as you can into the soil as you possibly can. Next slide. And so hopefully now these principles will make a little bit more sense, and kind of get into your heart and your head in a more interconnected way. Next slide. Because really it's like regenerative ecology is a good solution system for kind of the mess that we're in. And what it really means is living locally but learning globally, because anything we do has probably been done before, and probably done in a place where they've been doing it for a really long time. So don't be afraid to like learn lessons from other places, and just humbly take it as a gift, because the only way to be good ancestors is to live thinking regeneratively instead of exploitively. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think you really did a great job of framing the global aspect of all of this work and contextualizing it really well. I'm really grateful for all of those great photos that you have. I wish I was as well-traveled as you are. I'm going to ask a couple questions. We don't have a ton of time for questions because we do want to get to a quick little go around. But Kat and I will both ask you maybe 1 or 2 questions if that works for you.
Absolutely.
And so the question I'm going to ask is from the chat, and the question is, how can farms who are reliant on annual seed markets begin to transition toward landrace production and seed saving? And it's okay, you don't have the perfect answer, but just what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love seed saving. You know, a lot of that is looking at seed saving practices. So a good way to do it in your farming practice is to create seed swaps and seed sharing with farmers in your immediate area who have found plants that tend to be resilient to the conditions in which we are. So for example, at Cobb Hill where I live, I've started a project of collecting as many seeds from as many trees and plants as I possibly can, because a lot of ways of creating these landrace varieties is looking at plants that grow in the conditions where you are. And it's really cheap. I mean, learning to seed save can take just an hour of your time, and there's certain seasons where it's just incredibly productive. It's free. And there's a lot of people who can either show you how to do it or can trade with you to get those varieties really quickly. And there's some really good companies that sell them, but it's always good to keep it as local as you can, because that actually builds a lot of health for biodiversity and different types of ecological management. And so the more you can seed save from your region, the better it is actually for the planet.
Awesome, thank you. Kat, you have the next one?
I do, and I just put some links into the chat for folks to learn about Upper Valley Seed Savers and Solstice Seeds, which are both Upper Valley organizations. We're very lucky to have a lot of people in the Upper Valley working on saving seeds for us. And Solstice Seeds in Heartland is a place where you can buy those seeds and help that keep going. Yeah, Sarah, I would love to ask you about the Green New Deal. So Stephen mentioned in the chat that the Green New Deal in Vermont might be a way of moving forward. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on Vermont's Green New Deal?
You know, I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's a good step in the direction of looking differently at the collapse of our agricultural systems and how difficult it is for our systems probably to survive much into the next 100 years. So I think by having some of those mitigation measures, it's allowed us to look at the kind of inevitable economic failures of big agriculture. And so, however, I think the Green New Deal has to do a lot more with regeneration and regenerative ag, because currently, you know, if you have to provide a alternative system to the inevitable collapse of the dairy industry and other industries that we've become reliant on. And I don't think the Green New Deal goes far enough in saying, you know, what are the alternatives, you know, and how are we going to promote those through policies and practices, you know, both at the national level, but also just within our ecosystem here in Vermont.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. There are 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask a question about the images that you were showing that were incredibly motivating, and they clearly told a story of like before and after of peace and restoration and abundance for a region. And I think oftentimes we in America or Vermont, whatever you want to call our we, often think about conflict and degradation going on in other parts of the world, and we forget about the historical context in our own community. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about addressing how thinking about the environment really requires addressing human conflict, even in a place like the US.
I think that's a fabulous question. And, you know, we live on landscapes that have been exploited. You know, we have stolen land from people who had incredibly regenerative practices. You know, we've killed, you know, cultures that really had a relationship of interconnection with the land that really has I think, damaged our own souls a little bit. However, you know, saying that, I mean, I think if you look at Vermont, I mean, so much of Vermont was sheep pastures. Like where I live at Cobb Hill is a good example. I mean, they cut down a ton of trees so that they could have sheep. And then they denuded this landscape with all of these sheep. Not that sheep are bad, but it's just the way that it was practiced was really hard. And, you know, all of that came from a huge conflict that has happened for just, you know, we continue to have conflict even if we feel like we live in a place that has land that we may or may not own. And so I think that, you know, I always think that conflict is systemic and ancestral. Like we have to think about the fact that everything we do is going to cause tension. And so the more we can regenerate these practices and the more we can kind of build these practices back into our cosmology, I think the more important it is, because I think it kind of honors the people that we've exploited, and I think it kind of retilts the scales and kind of recalibrates our own systems a little bit. So in some ways I see regenerative ecology as a way of kind of making a little bit of peace with the fact that we have come from a very exploitive place, no matter where we are, kind of in our local ecology.
Thank you, Sarah. So related to that, I have a question. You know, we hear a lot about appropriation of ideas and cultures and how that's not a good thing. And I just wonder, I'm thinking that there might be other people on the call who wonder about the difference between adaptation of ideas and technologies from other cultures and appropriation of ideas and technologies from other cultures. And I just wonder, what are your thoughts on those particular words, and how do we modify our behaviors to make sure that we're adapting with love and resilience and respect?
You know, I've been involved in international permaculture for probably, I don't know, 20, 30 years or something. And I've felt that way a lot, you know, because I think acculturation is real. But I also think that it's also a state of mind where you can get to a place where you feel so guilty that you don't act in a way that makes you a good ancestor. And I really mean that seriously, which is that, you know, these are practices that have found their way into our consciousness. Like there are water systems and swale systems here that people are doing in Vermont that come from Chiapas, you know, and come from Peru. And so, you know, I think what we need to do is, rather than, you know, worry all the time about acculturation, we need to honor our ancestors and honor what we're doing, as these are practices that build the ecology of Earth. And I think it's a healing practice, because I think that feeling is real. I mean, I feel it myself, but I think it can be a healing practice to actually regenerate soil on the land.
Thank you.
That was a great answer.
That was a great answer.